It's just 4 months since Aston Villa came within a point of qualifying for the Champions League. Following 8 wins from the last 10 matches, which was the most of any Premier League team, Villa only missed out on 5th place to Newcastle on goal difference on the final day of the season. Villa have only played 5 Premier League matches since then, yet the mood at Villa Park has shifted dramatically during that time. In April, Villa went toe-to-toe with the best team in Europe in a Champions League quarter-final, beating them at home and very nearly teeing up a semi-final tie against Arsenal. 5 months on, they are in the Premier League relegation zone without a win from their opening 5 games and having scored the fewest number of goals of any team in the entire Football League pyramid. These were the nominees for Villa's August Goal of the Month competition. There weren't any nominees. They didn't score any goals. They also didn't nominate the sound of someone farting to a black background. That was artistic license on my part, admittedly, but you get the general idea. They've only scored 3 goals since then, 1 in the Europa League against Bologna, 1 in the League Cup third round away at Brentford, in a tie that they went on to lose, and 1 away at newly promoted Sunderland, who had been reduced to 10 men at 0-0 in the 33rd minute, in a game which ended 1-1. What makes Villa's wretched start even more abysmal is the fact that, on paper, they had a pretty generous run of fixtures in order to kickstart their campaign. They hosted a strikerless Newcastle team in transfer and Alexander Isak-related disarray on the opening day, which was probably the perfect time to play them, followed by a depleted Brentford team stripped of some of their best players and long-term manager, a winless Palace team who had also endured a fairly challenging window, relegation-threatened Everton, and newly promoted Championship playoff final winners Sunderland. In over an hour of football against a promoted club who were a man down, Villa created an expected goals of 0.78 at the Stadium of Light, whereas 10-man Sunderland's was 1.04. It is still early days this season, of course, but for a team that has enjoyed pretty much seamless progress since billionaire business partners Nassef Saveras and Wes Edens bought the club in 2018, and even more so since Unai Emory was appointed in 2022, it is a shocking regression that few people anticipated during pre-season. So just what on earth is going on at Aston Villa?
Marco Bisotto.
Who is to blame?
Marco Bisotto.
And could Villa really go from the Champions League to the Championship in a single season?
Marco Bisotto. The time is over.
Well, that's what today's video is all about, and I promise you, I won't just repeat the name Marco Bizzo like a malfunctioning Unai Emery for the next 30 minutes. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Aston, an area of inner Birmingham which gives its name to both a football club and a university, but not, I repeat, not to Aston Martin, which takes the Aston in its name from the Aston Hill climb in Buckinghamshire. I'm sure glad that we cleared that one up, as we take a look at the rise, fall, rise, and what is starting to feel worryingly like a fall again at Aston Villa, why Unai Emery's players no longer appear to be playing for one of the world's most highly regarded managers, and, ultimately, whether Villa's current strife represents a mere blip, or the potentially catastrophic undoing of 7 years of sensational progress. Among other things. Aston Villa occupy a bit of a strange status within English football. They are, by most metrics, the biggest club from the second biggest city in England, and the 7th most successful in English football as a whole. The so-called Big Six or Rich Six are the only teams who have won more, and even then, Villa have won more top-flight league titles than either Tottenham or Chelsea, and, unlike Tottenham and Arsenal, they have won the Champions League, or the European Cup as it was when Villa beat Bayern Munich 1-0 in the final in Rotterdam, back in 1982. Based upon the fundamentals then, Villa probably ought to be a super club. In reality, the revenue gap between themselves and even the lowest revenue-generating Big Six club, namely Chelsea, is almost as great as the gap between Villa and the average League Two team. Villa finished as runners-up in the inaugural Premier League campaign in 1992-93, and they won the League Cup in 2 out of the next 3 seasons, but that was followed by a couple of close shaves with relegation in the early to mid-2000s. In 2006, American businessman Randy Lerner bought Villa and appointed Martin O'Neill as manager, and in the last 3 out of his 4 seasons in charge at Villa Park, Villa consistently knocked on the door of Champions League football, without ever quite managing to break it down. O'Neill's unexpected resignation signalled a major regression, and the second half of Randy Lerner's decade of ownership, as Villa cycled through the likes of Alex McLeish, Paul Lambert and Tim Sherwood, was a pretty miserable affair. It culminated in relegation in 2016, and relegation in some style it must be said. The combined talents of Tim Sherwood and Remy Gard, and that is to say none, fused with the sales of Villa's 2 best players and inspired signings like Joleon Lescott and Mika Richards, conspired to create one of the worst Premier League teams of all time. Villa went bottom after 10 games and stayed there all season, winning 3 games and 17 points in total, conceding 76 goals and only scoring 27. The bad news was that Villa were relegated for the first time during the Premier League era, but the good news was that Joleon Lescott had his eyes on a lovely new motor, tweeting out this photograph of a Mercedes-Benz shortly after a 6-0 defeat against Liverpool.
You're still thinking about the bad news, aren't you? There's no good news, David. It's only bad news and irrelevant news. Yeah, that's not a phrase though, is it? I couldn't come out and go, oh, I've got some bad news and some irrelevant news.
Randy Lerner, and that is his real name, I'm not just referring to someone who was studying how to become aroused, sold up in 2016 after losing his arse on Villa, but Villa fans who thought that their problems would end there were in for a rude awakening. Whether things got worse, initially at least, is perhaps up for debate, but they certainly got a whole lot weirder. Little known, and indeed physically just quite little, Chinese businessman Tony Xia bought the club for a reported £76 million, appointing himself as club chairman. Xia's time at Villa was marked by intense spending and prolific tweeting, as Xia maintained what can only be described as a large digital footprint. Certainly much larger than his own diminutive frame and, one can only assume, actual footprint. Unfortunately, big-name signings like Ross McCormack, Jonathan Kodja, Scott Hogan, and Aaron Chibola all proved to be very expensive mistakes, causing Villa to finish 13th with one of the most expensively assembled and highest-paid squads that the Championship has ever seen. Meanwhile, Xia's unusual Twitter posts included cryptic quasi-mathematical transfer hints, like he was Taylor Swift leaving behind mysterious Easter eggs about his next album for confused Villa fans to try and solve, beefing with Ian Holloway's pre-season predictions, promising Champions League football in less than 5 years, and wishing prolific child sex abuser and necrophiliac Jimmy Savile a happy birthday, uncle. The word prolific can really go one of 2 ways as an adjective, can't it? Goal scoring? Good. A blood donor? Even better. A child sex abuser and necrophiliac? Much less admirable. In my opinion, anyway. In fairness to Xia, I don't think that he was aware of Savile or of his crimes. He was just tricked by a fiendish Twitter user named @ThisIsPriest into committing an embarrassing online social faux pas, unlike, of course, who all knew full well and still lobbied for him to be knighted. Following Villa's failure to win promotion in Xia's first season, everything unravelled in his second. On the pitch, Villa reached the playoff final, where they lost against Fulham, but off it, supposedly due to difficulties moving money from China to the United Kingdom, a £4 million unpaid tax bill very nearly saw the club issue with a winding up order and facing the genuine prospects of being liquidated. It was at this stage that NSWE stepped in and bought the club. Not to be confused with NSFW, which is what you now need age verification to view in the United Kingdom. NSWE was the original name for billionaire sports bros Wes Edens and Nassef Saveris' holding company, which bought Villa, and which has since been renamed V Sports. It's not exactly clear what the V stands for, but I choose to believe that it's very. Very Sports also invested heavily in Villa, but much more effectively, and without the unpaid tax bills or birthday messages for Jimmy Savile. In their first season, Very sacked Steve Bruce with Villa sat 12th and appointed Dean Smith, who oversaw a quite miraculous rise up the Championship table, culminating in himself and his captain Jack Grealish holding the playoff final trophy at the end of the season. I have made an entire video about Villa's rise, should you be interested. And you should, because it's very interesting. But the subject of today's video is their recent demise, so all of this is just setting the scene. Well, that and Jimmy Savile jokes. Basically, where other promoted clubs have fallen by the wayside in recent years, Villa, through a combination of major investments, ruthlessness, and a slice of good fortune on occasion, not only survived, but thrived in the Premier League. Dean Smith and Steven Gerrard oversaw the survival part, albeit that might not have lasted long under Gerrard. Meanwhile, Unai Emery has been the principal instigator of the thriving. A major coup by Villa early in the 2022-23 season. The club were 15th when Steven Gerrard was sacked. Meanwhile, Unai Emery had recently won his 4th Europa League crown with Villarreal and had turned down the opportunity to join Newcastle. He accepted Villa's advances, but on one condition. He could run the club like his own personal fiefdom. In an era of head coaches who lay out cones for training sessions and give motivational speeches about light bulbs, or something, Emory is an old-school English manager, in the sense that he exercises an enormous amount of control over the club's operations from top to bottom. Not in the sense that he thinks XG is woke, or has an inexplicable hatred for Paul Pogba. Emory guided Villa from a relegation scrap to Conference League qualification in his debut campaign, Champions League football in his second, and the Europa League in his third. Over the last 3 seasons, only Man City, Arsenal, Liverpool and Newcastle have won more points than Villa, and Newcastle only by 2 points prior to the start of this season, and that includes the disastrous end of Steven Gerrard's tenure. It is a remarkable set of achievements, but they are achievements which have been achieved, primarily, by players that Unai Emery inherited at Villa Park. Villa's star men under Emory, Ollie Watkins, Emi Martinez, John McGinn, were all at the club before he arrived, and whilst his ability to bring the best out of them, something that Steven Gerrard was very clearly failing to do, deserves immense credit, failure to regenerate and refresh the squad isn't a new problem. It's just one which has become a much bigger talking point in light of Villa's terrible start to the season. 9 of Villa's starting 11 against Sunderland last week were at the club when Unai Emery arrived. No other Premier League team had more starters who had been at the club for 3 years or more. That's partly because the players Emery inherited have done such a good job for him, and Villa have fought tooth and nail to keep hold of most of them, but it's also because Villa have consistently failed to strengthen their first team through recruitment. In Emery's first summer in charge, Villa appointed experienced Spaniard Monchi as their sporting director. Though Emory played a pivotal role in Monchi's appointment, having worked alongside him at Sevilla, Villa's first choice was actually Barcelona's soon-to-depart sporting director, Mathieu Alemán. A divisive figure, Monchi undoubtedly oversaw some outstanding recruitment during his first 17 years as sporting director at Sevilla, from 2000 to 2017. When Sevilla first appointed Emory in 2013, fresh off the back of his failed stint managing in Russia, the Basque tactician didn't hold all the cards. Within that relationship, Monchi was top dog, wielding enormous control at Sevilla, especially in terms of recruitment, whereas Emory was tasked principally, especially at the start, with maximising the talents of the players that he was given. He did a very good job at that, as he has done at most clubs, and it proved to be a very fruitful partnership. Emory left Sevilla in 2016 to join PSG, meanwhile Monchi departed with an elite reputation in 2017. Despite links with the likes of Man United, Real Madrid, Barcelona and Emery's new club PSG, Monchi ultimately accepted an offer from Roma, citing the degree of control that the Italians promised him as his primary justification. In his own words, quote, "It allowed me to continue being Monchi and to work as I've always done." End quote. In his first job outside of Andalusia, though, Monchi was a disaster. In just shy of 2 years at Roma, he oversaw a major squad overhaul as the likes of Mohamed Salah, Antonio Rudiger and Alisson Becker departed, and Patrick Schick, Steven Nzonzi and Javier Pastore were brought in. Over €250 million was spent, but Roma fell from Serie A runners-up and 4 points off the title the season before he was appointed, to 6th place and 24 points off the title in the season that he departed. If you wanted to be uber generous, anyone would have struggled to replace some of Roma's departures, but Monchi oversaw a particularly poor transition, with many Roma supporters accusing him of setting the club back the best part of a decade and holding him responsible for their financial difficulties and ongoing FFP restrictions to this day. Following his Roma exit, Monchi rejoined Sevilla, where he helped return the club to the Champions League, but not without significant cost. Monchi oversaw unprecedented levels of spending at Sevilla, in direct contrast with his strategy of developing homegrown and undervalued young players in his first 17 years at the club. His first summer heralded almost €200 million of investment, some of which, such as Ronnie Lopez, Munis de Boer, and the very highly paid Chicharito, proved to be badly misjudged. Though Monchi is still very highly thought of at Sevilla due to the huge role that he played in their initial rise, he is also held liable by some Sevistas for their subsequent financial plight, not dissimilar to Roma's. In Monchi's final season at Sevilla, the club fell from 4th to 12th place, and though a Europa League crown papered over some of the cracks of the club's worst league campaign in over 20 years, in the same summer that Monchi left Sevilla for a second time in order to be reunited with Unai Emery at Aston Villa, Sevilla announced that they had debts totaling €90 million and put their entire first-team squad up for sale. In the 2 seasons since then, Sevilla, the kings of the Europa League, have finished 14th and 17th, only avoiding relegation by a single point last season. Sevilla are still under the strictest spending limits in all of La Liga, which is a reflection of the club's ongoing financial crisis, as a hangover from dubious spending, much of it sanctioned by Monchi. It's difficult not to draw some parallels between Roma and Sevilla's regulatory headaches following unwise spending on Monchi's watch, and Aston Villa's current difficulties relating to PSR, though there are some important nuances that must be taken into account. Villa's regulatory woes, for example, somewhat predate Monchi and even Emery's arrivals, or at the very least had most likely already become inevitable further down the line. Villa have only made a profit once over the last 10 years, and that was less than £1 million in the 2021-22 season, in which they sold Jack Grealish to Man City for a British record transfer fee. Some of the club's most reckless financial decisions, like paying a reported £25 million for Danny Ings, plus a reported £125,000 a week in wages, forking out a club record £38 million on the underwhelming Emi Buendia, and, perhaps most notably, signing a washed-up Philippe Coutinho for a reported €20 million, on a 4-year deal reported to be worth more than £25 million, all predated Emery and Monchi's arrivals. In fact, since Monchi arrived, Villa have basically been forced to balance the books in terms of player trading, with a net spend of less than £10 million, constituting among the lowest in the Premier League. I saw the journalist Rory Smith, whose work I've often enjoyed, so this isn't a personal or specific thing, stating that Villa had, quote, spent an absolute fortune on a recent episode of the BBC's Monday Night Club podcast, in which he claimed that Villa had spent, quote, colossal sums more than Bayern Munich, AC Milan, and Inter Milan.
They've spent an absolute fortune. They've spent way more money than most teams in Europe. They've spent colossal sums more than Bayern Munich and AC Milan and Inter Milan and all these other sides.
Now, what constitutes an absolute fortune is subjective, I suppose, so that's fair game. Villa have certainly kept themselves busy in the transfer market prior to this season, but I'm not sure where the idea that they have spent colossal sums more than Bayern Munich and AC Milan comes from. Inter Milan, solely on transfer fees, where they spend very little, fair enough, but then again, Brentford, Burnley and Leeds have all also spent more than them over the last, say, 3 or 4 seasons. And even then, Villa actually have a lower net spend. AC Milan, meanwhile, have a higher spend and net spend, over pretty much any time frame, insofar as I can make out. And as for Bayern Munich, there is really no comparison. Bayern have a higher transfer expenditure and net spend than Villa, both since Emery and Monchi's appointments, and even their wage bill, at €430 million, is nearly 50% higher than Villa's, and higher than all but 2 Premier League clubs. The only way in which Villa could be described as paying colossal sums more than Bayern Munich, AC Milan and Inter Milan is relative to their revenue, as we will come on to, but I don't think that there is even the vaguest hint that that's what Smith was alluding to. So I think that's a bit of a misconception, specifically in terms of recent transfer expenditure and certainly net spend, which it felt right to touch upon in case it may be widespread. Nonetheless, over £300 million has still been spent in a little over 2 years, with frighteningly little to show for it. Moussa Diaby came and went in a single season, albeit at no great financial cost. Amadou Onana and Ian Maatsen have failed to justify their combined fees, reported to be in excess of €100 million. And Donyell Marlon arrived for big money and on big wages, but in over 8 months at Villa Park, he has played fewer than 450 minutes, or 5 full 90-minute matches, of Premier League football. Marlon supposedly joined Villa in order to play Champions League football, yet he wasn't even named in Unai Emery's squad for the tournament's knockout stages last season. That was because of the later January arrivals of Axel Disasi on loan from Chelsea, and forwards Marcus Rashford and Marco Asensio on loan from Manchester United and PSG, with UEFA only allowing 3 new players to be registered following the January window, with Emery picking those 3 ahead of him. In truth, had Villa known that they would get late deals done for both Rashford and Asensio, it seems unlikely that they would have splashed out, given some of their financial headaches on Marlon, and this has been a persistent problem in recent windows. PSR has become a comforting excuse for bad recruitment and inactivity at a lot of clubs. Even West Ham invoke it despite being in absolutely no regulatory trouble whatsoever, but it has certainly impacted Villa's business, particularly in the window just gone. Because Villa are cautiously attempting to balance the books, it means that they can't proactively make significant moves in the transfer markets. This summer, for example, it was reported that Villa were open to offers for the likes of Emi Martinez, Luca Dean, and, albeit reluctantly, perhaps even the likes of Watkins and Kamara before the latter signed a new deal, because they were desperately in need of at least one big sale. In the end, despite Martinez most notably waving goodbye to supporters, and bidding farewell to his teammates in the hope of an ultimately collapsed move to Manchester United, Villa never received what they considered to be reasonable offers for any of those players. Jacob Ramsey became the fall guy, since Villa still needed that big sale, joining arguably Villa's biggest rivals in terms of disrupting the Big Six, Newcastle, for a reported £40 million fee. Ramsey's sale could be booked as pure profit, as a homegrown academy graduate, a regulatory manoeuvre that we have seen repeatedly deployed by the likes of Chelsea, Liverpool, and indeed Villa themselves, but unlike Villa's other potential departees, Ramsey wasn't reported to be on especially high wages. It's no secret that Villa's wage bill is almost as chunky as Big John's Chinese takeaway order. In the club's last set of fully published accounts, for the 2023-24 season, Villa's wage bill stood at £252 million, the 6th highest wage bill in the Premier League, above Spurs, despite Villa having almost half Tottenham's revenue. What that means, or meant at least, is that Villa spent 91% of their turnover on wages in the 2023-24 season, which was the highest figure in the Premier League. Fellow PSR strugglers Nottingham Forest spent their next most, at 88%, meanwhile Villa's Big Six disrupting rivals Newcastle spent just 68%, and the Big Six's lowest spenders Tottenham spent less than half as much of their revenue on wages, with a division-low 42% wage-to-turnover percentage. This helps to explain why, despite balancing the books in terms of player trading under Monchi, and having a pretty low net spend under Unai Emery overall, Villa have still posted pre-tax losses of £85.9 and £120.3 million over the last 2 seasons, and operating losses of close to £300 million during that time. Over the last 3 years as a whole, up to 2023-24, Villa lost £206 million, only avoiding a PSR breach by £12 million as a result of a whopping £90 million of allowable deductions. Villa are big spenders on youth development, £20 million annually in their last accounts, which constituted over half of their deductions. Last season's calculations will likely have been even tighter still, with the 2021-22 season, in which Villa sold Jack Grealish and posted a tiny profit, falling out of the 3-year monitoring period, and replaced by the 2024-25 campaign. That was reflected in the sales of Jean Duran, Moussa Diaby, Douglas Luiz, and a handful of academy graduates, as Villa raised a club record £225 million in player sales, as they desperately sought to avoid sanctions. They also spent almost £190 million last season, though, both increasing the club's ongoing amortisation costs and meaning that the club's burdensome wage bill is not only unlikely to have fallen to any notable extent, but is actually expected to have risen slightly due to various contract extensions and bonus payments. What's more, whilst Villa have so far avoided any sanctions or fines for breaching the Premier League spending regulations, they have had no such luck with UEFA. In July, Villa were fined €11 million or £9.5 million for breaching both UEFA's squad cost control ratios and football earnings rules, along with Chelsea, who were fined £27 million. The danger for Villa, who made no mention of UEFA's spending and loss limits in their last set of accounts, is that UEFA's punishments become increasingly draconian with every breach. Whereas first-time offences are met with fines, which are often deemed to be quite lenient, future breaches guarantee much stricter fines and can carry sporting as well as financial penalties. Part of the problem for Villa is that, again, unlike the Premier League, UEFA took a fairly dim view of some of the club's so-called PSR transfers, with fellow PSR trouble clubs like Chelsea, Everton and Newcastle. The good news for Villa, on that front at least, is that they might not be in Europe next season, though that is of course bad news from pretty much every other perspective.
You're still thinking about the bad news, aren't you?
In Jacob Ramsey, Villa not only lost a popular member of the squad, among teammates and supporters, Azza Brummy, who was born 3 miles from Villa Park, who was among the youngest and most energetic starters in an ageing and stagnating squad, while earning a modest salary in relative terms. They also lost someone, unlike Martinez, Rodgers and Watkins, according to some reports, who didn't want to leave and, to quite plainly in my view, their biggest direct rivals. What's more, Ramsey left fairly late on in the window, after the first game of the season, against Newcastle, which meant that Villa couldn't use the proceeds from his sale to get any early business done. Evan Gessan, signed for €30 million from Nice, was the only player that Villa signed for a significant fee all window. Meanwhile, Unai Emery's 34-year-old GOAT Marco Bizot was brought in for a nominal fee from fellow French outfit Brest as a replacement for backup goalkeeper Robin Olsen. Centre-back Victor Lindelof arrived on a free transfer from Manchester United, and both Jadon Sancho and Harvey Elliott were signed on loan. Elliott's loan deal contains an obligation for Villa to make the deal a permanent one at the end of this season, for a reported £35 million, structured in that way for PSR reasons. If you took a shot every time that I said PSR in this video, chances are you would have scored more goals this season than Villa. It must be said, despite only missing out on Champions League qualification on goal difference, the warning signs were already there for Villa last season. Villa were in the bottom half in terms of expected goals last season, and despite outperforming their expected goals, which tends not to be sustainable to any significant extent long term, they still scored fewer goals than the likes of Brighton, Brentford and even 17th place Spurs. They also ranked 10th in terms of progressive carries, 12th in terms of progressive passes, 12th in terms of touches inside of the opposition's box, and I could go on. Basically, Villa ranked in the bottom half by an astonishing number of metrics for a team that was playing in the Champions League and knocking on the door of qualifying for Europe's Premier Cup competition again, but they ground out just enough points by being direct and fairly clinical to mask a lot of those underlying issues. There was a narrative, when Villa lost against Crystal Palace at Wembley in the FA Cup semi-final, 11 days after they had been knocked out of the Champions League by PSG last season, that they had bottled the chance to reach the FA Cup final, when, in reality, Crystal Palace are a very good team who were as good as Villa by a number of metrics last season, and perfectly capable of beating them without needing Villa to fold or crumble under the pressure. As is so often the case, people tend to overlook how strong and competitive the middle of the Premier League is, everyone from about 4th through to 14th in recent years, and how easy it is to drop down the table if you get just a few big decisions wrong. Clubs like Brighton, Bournemouth, Brentford, Palace and Fulham are ready and waiting to eat your lunch these days. If Manchester United and Tottenham, two of the 9 richest clubs in all of world football, are capable of finishing 15th and 17th when having off seasons in the Premier League, then so too are Aston Villa, and, based upon all of the fundamentals, much more easily so in fact. I digress. Villa basically failed to address any of these glaring weaknesses, either positionally, tactically, physically, or in terms of the age composition of their squad over pre-season, either because they were prevented from doing so due to financial restrictions, or because they were incapable of doing so due to their own failures in terms of recruitment. In reality, it was a bit of both. For all of their faults last season, however, Villa have been a pale imitation of their former selves this season, lacking in any kind of intensity or ideas. This is a team which, on paper, whatever you say regarding recruitment, is still good enough to finish in the top half, and is certainly good enough to beat a newly promoted Sunderland team with a man advantage for over an hour. The back 5 of Martinez, Cash, Konsa, Mings and Digne is a very familiar one at this stage, which ought to breed confidence and understanding, with the likes of Ian Maatsen, Pau Torres, Victor Lindelof, and the GOAT of course, Marco Bizzo waiting in the wings. In midfield, Youri Tielemans is a big loss, and Amadou Onana is also currently sidelined, but John McGinn and Boubacar Kamara have both been brilliant players for Villa. Morgan Rogers received rave reviews throughout all of last season, and is now a full England international hoping to be at next summer's World Cup. Ollie Watkins has been one of the most prolific goal scorers in England's top flight since joining Villa over 5 years ago, and then, on the bench alone against Sunderland, you had the varied talents of Harvey Elliott, Daniel Marlon, and Jadon Sancho. Factor in Unai Emery, one of the most highly rated managers not just in English but all of European football, and, however early in the season, this isn't a squad that we should be talking about not being able to score goals or compete, and, in some quarters, even as potential relegation candidates. Very clearly, therefore, there are other factors at play and other things that have gone wrong for Aston Villa. A big problem is the lack of pace and width in the team, which was temporarily masked by Marcus Rashford and Marco Asensio's loan moves, but now looks to be a glaring weakness, and one which even Unai Emery is struggling to identify the solutions to. Whilst Harvey Elliott and Jadon Sancho were welcome late arrivals, following such a quiet window in terms of incomings, neither of them hugged the touchline, preferring to drift deeper and more central in an attempt to get the ball, nor are they especially fond of running in behind, putting on the afterburners, and leaving players for dead. Evan Gessan, likewise, was probably best deployed as an inside forward at Nice, drifting in off the right or sometimes the left flank, finding cliched pockets of space, running at people, and looking to get a shot on goal. Out of the three, Gessan is probably the quickest and most disciplined when asked to stay wide, but even he played almost as many games through the middle last season as he did on the right, and his Villa career is yet to ignite. Then there's the fact that almost none of them want to play on the right wing. The struggling Gessan is the only quasi-exception, but everyone else, Elliott, Sancho, Rogers, Buendia, either wants to play on the left, and typically as a left-sided attacking midfielder or inside forward, or through the middle as a number 10. From the outside looking in at least, it appears to be a pretty monumental failure in terms of squad planning to have arrived at such a positionally incoherent state several years into a seemingly carefully constructed project, especially in an era, and in a league, where speed and dynamism reign supreme. Tactically, Villa look a mess, and that's not something that you can typically say about an Unai Emery team. Emery is renowned for his intensity and meticulous attention to detail. He obsesses over games, opponents, structures and systems. He gives long and detailed team meetings and specific instructions. In the past, Villa players have hung on to his every word, which is unsurprising since the results have been so emphatic, and virtually every player that he inherited has played the best football of their careers underneath him. It's also likely laborious and mentally taxing though, especially when juggling the Premier League with European football and the two domestic cup competitions with a relatively thin squad for a third successive season. The longest that Emery has ever spent at a club is just under 4 years, and even that was well over a decade ago. He spent just 2 years at Lorca Deportiva, 2 years at Almeria, 2 years at PSG, 2.5 years at Sevilla, 18 months at Arsenal, just over 2 years at Villarreal, and barely 6 months at Spartak Moscow. This is a man who's very good at turning clubs around on a short-term basis, improving the players that he inherits and winning games, particularly in cup competitions, for 2 to maybe 3 years. This is not someone, for all of his strengths, and they are both numerous and highly laudable, who has built successful long-term projects, regenerated squads, exhibited any significant talent in terms of player recruitment, or integrated large numbers of young players and academy graduates into his side. One is reluctant to even hint at the faintest idea that Emory could be to blame for some of Villa's struggles, since it is in large part thanks to him that they are able to regress from such heights at all, but it doesn't seem inconceivable that some of their players are suffering from a form of Emory-related fatigue, overthinking, and overcomplication. Villa have actually kept the third most possession of any team in the Premier League so far this season, trailing only Liverpool and Chelsea. But they have the lowest expected goals, the fewest goal-creating actions, by far, with only 2. The next lowest is 6, meanwhile Liverpool have 20, and only Leeds have managed to fashion fewer shots on target. All of that with nearly 60% possession. This is not an Unai Emery team playing anything that even remotely resembles what we think of as Unai Emery football. Either his football principles 180'd over the summer, for some completely unknown reason, or his players are no longer willing or able to execute his ideas. Emery, unsurprisingly, seems to think that it's the latter, even accusing his own players of being lazy in their defeat against Sunderland, a criticism so scathing that it is very rarely levelled by a coach towards their own players, but Emery is probably one of few managers who feels powerful enough to wield it. Beyond the tactics, though more speculative, it seems inarguable at this stage that there is some degree of unrest within the Villa dressing room. When Jacob Ramsey was sold to Newcastle, both Tyrone Mings and John McGinn, 2 Villa stalwarts, took to social media with slightly unusual posts, Mings telling supporters that they, quote, don't know the half of it, and McGinn describing Ramsey's departure as a sad day that, quote, seems to be the way that football is set up these days. It wasn't quite as cryptic as prime Tony Xia, RIP to the greatest to ever do it. He isn't actually dead, should be said. He just hasn't tweeted since COVID. But it was all a little bit strange, and it gave the impression that all was not well behind the scenes, which seems to have been reflected in Villa's start to this season. Added to that, you have got players like Ollie Watkins, Morgan Rogers, and certainly Emi Martinez, who have perhaps had their heads turned at times, and have either contemplated or outright expressed an interest in joining other clubs, but who are still there, Rogers in particular, having looked almost uninterested at times this season, and even being booed by Villa fans, other than when he was on international duty with England and he looked brilliant again. Meanwhile, some players took pay cuts in light of Villa's regulatory headaches, but others refused them, potentially leading to further unrest. And then you are bound to have a few eyebrows raised when the club pleads poverty to several players in contract negotiations, before bringing in Jadon Sancho, who earns a reported £200,000 a week, 80% of which will reportedly be covered by Villa for the duration of his loan, which would make him the highest paid player at the club. There is also an inevitable sense of stagnation, caused both by Villa's failure to refresh their squad, and a partially self-inflicted and a partially enforced lack of ambition in the transfer market. In the back of many Villa players' minds, and in the front of some of them no doubt, it's probably difficult to escape the conclusion that the team's fortunes and perhaps even their own careers have already peaked, and that a 4th place finish in 2023-24 and that quarter-final defeat against PSG last season were as good as things are ever going to get. Monchi's departure can be viewed in one of 2 ways, either as further evidence of Villa's ensuing crisis, or as a timely refresh, with plenty of time ahead of the next winter and summer windows, replacing someone who hasn't done an especially distinguished job, and endured a power struggle with Unai Emery, with someone who has been lauded for the job that he has done at Real Sociedad over the last 7 or 8 years. I mentioned earlier that Monchi went from being top dog at Sevilla, with Unai Emery working below him, to being brought to Villa on Emery's instructions, as Villa's second choice, and requiring Emery's approval when it came to all incomings and outgoings. It was a shift in terms of the power dynamic between the duo that never appeared to be fully resolved, And though Roberto Alabe won't have that problem, the degree of power that Villa have afforded Emory, in a world where club presidents, sporting directors, and directors of football increasingly reign supreme, was always liable to be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it gave Villa access to a world-class manager who would otherwise have been beyond their reach, who has scaled unimaginable heights and returned them to the Champions League after more than 4 decades. But it meant that either whenever Emory was poached by someone else, or things started to go wrong, Villa would likely face a very sharp and painful transition. The caveat to all of this, which I've no doubt someone will point out in the comments, is that it is still very early days. We are only 5 games into the season, under a manager who has taken Villa from a relegation scrap to the Champions League, and going toe-to-toe with the best team on the planet. But it would be head in the sand stuff to pretend that this is just a poor start.
And I think you are an ostrich.
Villa's performances have been as bad, if not worse than their results in the league so far this season, and had things gone only very slightly differently in a couple of those games, they could very easily have 0 points from what was, on paper, a fairly generous start to the campaign, and the total collapse in form of almost all of their players, and particularly their star players and midfielders and forwards, seems to go beyond a fleeting flash of misfortune. What's more, Villa fans have every right to complain, if not necessarily about their turgid start to the season following 3 fantastic campaigns, then certainly about how much they're being charged to watch it. Tickets in the Holt End for Villa's opening game of the season against Newcastle were priced at £77. Tickets for the Champions League group stage last season were priced at £85, £94 and £97, or £70, £79 and £82 for season ticket holders. If Very Sports keep going with price hikes like that, then pretty soon, Prince William will be the only Villa fan left who can actually afford to watch them. Anyway, that is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. It was a struggle for me to get through, as you may be able to tell, I am what can only be described as ill. But I hope you enjoyed it nonetheless. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know, or you just feel sorry for me. Why not? I'll take what I can get. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course make sure you're subscribed, and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens any minute now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on various social media platforms, should you be so inclined, typically via the username at HITC Sevens, and you can now support me additionally, should you be feeling very generous or just want to become a channel member, either via the Alfie Potsama YouTube channel, or even better still, via buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potsama. Rihanna's done it, so, you might want to join. I will see you all shortly. Please take care out there. I hope that you don't get ill like me. I don't think that sort of thing can be transmitted through YouTube videos, so you should be safe on that front. I'll see you soon. Love you all. Cheers.